Invite viewers to post their location and local time, because sometimes the smallest detail, like where you're sitting right now, changes how you hear a story, and this one will need your full attention. Richard Blackwood, a man whose shirts cost more than some folks' monthly rent, is standing in the doorway of a sun-drenched nursery, and his world is suddenly upside down. For 2 years, his 6-year-old daughter Isabella has not spoken a single word. Selective mutism. The doctors called it something probably permanent. Yet here she is, standing by the piano, singing in perfect French while her nanny, Kesha, plays along like this is just another Tuesday afternoon. Historians still argue whether the most shocking part is the flawless accent or the fact that Richard, for once, is actually speechless. What the hell is going on? He barks, the kind of bark that makes expensive crystal tremble in cabinets. Isabella freezes, the notes dying on her lips, while Kesha rises slowly from the bench, placing one calm hand on the child's shoulder. "Sir, she's always been able to speak," she says evenly. She chooses who she talks to. This does not go over well. Imagine telling a man who trusts medical reports more than birthday wishes that his daughter's voice just needed an audience who listened. Richard laughs, but it's not the fun kind, it's the "I'm about to fire someone" kind. He talks about the best specialists money can buy, about years of therapy, about how Kesha has no medical training. Kesha, who actually graduated from Columbia with honors in child psychology, doesn't flinch. She explains that Isabella tells her incredible stories every day, that the girl knows 3 languages and 4 instruments. Richard calls it lies, because for him, the idea that a 6-year-old could hide brilliance behind silence is as absurd as using crocodile dung sunscreen, something ancient Egyptians swore by, though no dermatologist today would recommend it. And then Isabella steps out from behind Kesha. Her voice is clear, almost too mature for her age. "Daddy, I talk. I just don't talk to people who don't want to listen." The silence that follows could rival a snow-covered forest, thick, cold, and absolute. Richard's face tightens. He's not the kind to admit fault, especially not in front of someone he sees as just the help. The tension in the air could slice bread. "Pack your things," he says. "You're fired." Isabella screams, an actual scream, man, clings to Kesha's dress like she's holding onto the last lifeboat on the Titanic. Richard ignores her, calls security, and even orders the housekeeper to lock Isabella in her room until this situation is over. The door shuts with a finality that feels medieval, and Kesha just stands there, not defeated but calculating, like a chess player who's just lost a rook but sees checkmate 5 moves ahead. She asks one question before leaving. "Do you really believe your daughter is incapable, or are you afraid she's smarter than you think?" That one lands harder than he'll admit. Richard doesn't answer her question, just glances at his Rolex like the truth has an expiration date, and she's already passed it. He calls her just a nanny, the way someone might call a Stradivarius just an old violin, and insists there's nothing left to discover about his daughter. But Kesha has been quietly compiling 2 months' worth of conversations, songs, and drawings, little flashes of genius from a child dismissed as broken. She slips her hand into her bag and produces a small digital recorder. She wanted someone to hear her, Kesha says, voice calm but edged with steel. 2 hours of her speaking, singing, reasoning in ways no doctor has ever seen, because they weren't looking. Historians still argue whether Richard's pale reaction is fear or rage, but both fit. He rips the recorder from her hand, spitting words about privacy and rules. She simply replies, "There are more." The silence stretches, broken only by Isabella's muffled crying down the hall. It's then Kesha drops her real demand, not money, not her job back. Stop treating her like a failed project. See her for what she is. For Richard, that's not a request. It's a declaration of war. 3 days later, Kesha is gone. In her place, Richard hires Margaret Foster, a 60-year-old British professional whose credentials could wallpaper the guest wing. Margaret is polite, precise, and most importantly to Richard, silent about family matters. Carmen, the housekeeper, reports that Isabella hasn't spoken since Kesha left, refuses meals, and is making those strange humming sounds again when upset. Richard waves it off as adjusting, like buying a new car that just needs breaking in. Margaret, however, notices more than she lets on. Over dinner, she tries a gentle approach, telling Isabella she doesn't have to talk, but she'd love to know her better. Isabella looks up for the first time in days and writes on a napkin, "Is Kesha coming back?" The handwriting is neat, almost adult-like. Margaret doesn't lie. She just says she doesn't know. Isabella writes again. Kesha knew that. Margaret wonders if she stepped into something larger than her pay grade. That night, her phone buzzes a message from an unknown number. It's Kesha. She's polite but direct. "I know you're a professional, but if you've noticed things, we should talk. Isabella needs our help." Margaret looks over the sleeping child, napkin still clutched in her hand, and feels a knot in her chest. She's cared for hundreds of children, but this one feels like she's surviving a siege no one else can see. Across town, Kesha is deep in Project Isabella, sifting through recordings, notes, and photos. David Martinez, her lawyer, tells her the evidence is damning racial prejudice, emotional neglect, willful misrepresentation of a child's abilities. They could win in court, easily. But Kesha wants something more than a legal win. She wants Richard Blackwood to stand in front of the world and acknowledge his daughter's brilliance. She wants him to face the kind of truth you can't buy your way out of. And she's not above using the one arena where money means nothing: public opinion. A week later, Richard wakes to a trifecta of bad omens: in email from Children's Services scheduling an urgent home assessment, a missed call from his personal lawyer, and a terse message. Press conference today, 3 p.m., Columbia University Children's Rights Center. Attendance recommended. KJ historians still argue whether his first reaction was fury or dread. But either way, he's in his office within minutes, demanding answers from David Martinez. An hour later, Richard sits in a conference room, watching Dr. Sarah Chun, one of the top child development experts in the country, systematically dismantle the narrative he's built around his daughter. Audio plays of Isabella singing an opera in Italian, her voice like spun glass in sunlight. Another clip has her explaining to Kesha how she pretended to have more difficulties than she did because it was the only way to get her father's attention. Richard tries to interject about illegal recordings, but David reminds him that in New York, educational documentation is legal when neglect is suspected. Then Kesha walks in, carrying a thick folder, and the room's temperature seems to change. She lays out drawings, musical compositions, even short poems, 2 months of evidence showing a gifted child thriving under care that saw her as more than a diagnosis. The coup de grace comes when Dr. Chun reveals that neurological testing shows Isabella never had cognitive limitations at all. Her mutism was a shield, not a prison. David slides a document across the table. Supervised joint custody, mandatory counseling for Richard. Isabella will enter a gifted program at Columbia. Kesha will be her official educational tutor. "What do you want from me?" Richard asks, his voice small for the first time. "I want you to be the father she deserves," Kesha says simply. That afternoon, the press conference turns Isabella's story into a national talking point about hidden potential and the harm of parental prejudice. That just a nanny, Richard dismissed, is now celebrated as a rising scholar. 6 months later, Richard sits front row at Columbia, watching his daughter, fluent in 5 languages, composer of 3 original works, accept a Medal of Honor for academic excellence. When she steps off stage, she asks, "Are you proud of me now?" And he hugs her, whispering that he always was. He just had to learn how to see it. Kesha's revenge isn't in ruining him, it's in transforming him, turning contempt into understanding, replacing neglect with pride. Margaret Foster stands nearby, smiling as Isabella runs across the garden with other gifted children, the sunlight catching her hair. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest victory here isn't in proving someone wrong, but in saving them from themselves. The air in the garden feels lighter now, like the world finally made room for a small voice that was always worth hearing. The chatter of children blends with the rustle of leaves, a sound so ordinary yet so precious. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the piano again, and a little girl singing in French not to prove anything, not to defy anyone, but simply because she can. And somewhere, the man who once saw her as a failed project now listens without fear, maybe for the first time in his life. The story drifts now into something softer, slower, the kind of pace where each breath feels deliberate. The grand arcs of confrontation and revelation have passed, leaving only the quiet work of mending. In the weeks after that medal ceremony, Richard begins to show up for Isabella in ways that don't make headlines, sharing breakfast without checking his phone, sitting through her endless questions about the stars, even listening to her stumble through a new piano piece without correcting her. These are small moments, the kind that can seem trivial to outsiders, but to a child, they're the bricks of trust laid one by one. Kesha's role shifts, too. She's no longer the outsider pushing against locked doors, but a guide who knows when to step back and let father and daughter find their own rhythm. She watches them from a gentle distance, knowing that healing is not a straight road, and that some days will still be clouded. But there's light now, steady and patient. Margaret remains part of the circle, not as a formal caregiver, but as a family friend who brings books, tells old stories, and reminds them all that the past doesn't have to dictate the shape of the future. The house that once echoed with silence now carries the hum of everyday life footsteps, laughter, even the occasional off-key singing drifting down the hall. And as evening falls over that garden, the sun dipping low behind the hedges, there's a sense that the hardest part isn't winning the battles, it's keeping the peace afterward. The child at the center of it all, once a mystery wrapped in diagnoses and doubt, now walks freely, her voice unbound, her world wide open. And for those who learned to truly listen, it's a sound worth everything.